Yo boys, what is up? Today we are back playing some more MX Bikes. Gonna be a little bit different of a video today. So I was browsing around on YouTube and I haven't really seen that many videos on people talking about suspension, how to set up suspension in MX Bikes, this and that. I did find one video that was about 45 minutes long. I watched through the whole entire thing, wrote a bunch of stuff down on a piece of paper. So I'm going to be kind of walking you guys through that today, just to put another video out there on YouTube on suspension. This might not be 100% correct. I am just going off of the other video that I saw. So if any of this is incorrect, please feel free to let me know in the comments what I said wrong and how I can fix it, and I will make another update video on that. With all that being said, let's jump right into this. Okay, now that we are in our garage and we are in the suspension tuning area of our garage, I will show you guys the default and kind of run through how everything works. This might be a little bit longer of a video. I'm going to try and keep it as short as I can and as brief as I can, but give you all the information that you need. So fuel, when you lower your fuel, that is going to adjust the weight of the dirt bike. The less fuel, the more nimble and quick handling the dirt bike is going to feel. The more fuel, the more sluggish the bike is going to feel. Now, mind you, these are just very minor differences. You're not going to be able to tell a whole lot in game. You'll be able to tell a little bit, but it's not going to make a drastic difference. Tires, obviously, you know, those are just tires. Really not much explaining to be said there. They kind of explain themselves. Sand tires, 120 is going to be the width of the tire. So the first number is always going to be the width of the tire. So if you want a wider tire, run 120. If you want a slimmer tire, run 100. 120 is going to give you a little bit more grip, while 100 is going to give you a little bit more top speed, is kind of what I've found in this game. Front brake lever, I could be wrong on this, so feel free to correct me. I believe 20 millimeters is going to improve your front brake. It's going to make it lock up quicker. 16 mil is going to make it lock up a little bit slower than if you had the 20 mil on. Master, there is none for the front brake. Rear cylinder, there is none for that as well. On any of the bikes, there's none of those. There's just the front lever here and the rear disc. Same thing with the front and the rear brakes. 240 mil is going to make it lock up way quicker. 220 mil is going to make it lock up a little bit slower. So if you want the back wheel to lock up to maybe square up a berm when you're riding Supercross, you might want to run 240, while 220 is not going to quite lock up that rear wheel as much. That also kind of depends on your controller settings and how you have them set up for your brakes and all of that. So that covers the general tab. Let's jump into suspension. So with spring does two things. Number one, it adjusts your sag settings for your bike, so how high and or low the bike is going to sit. Number two, it also adjusts how much weight the spring can take. Your forks or your rear shock both have a spring on them. So the higher the number, the more weight they can take. The lower the number, the less weight they can take. Adjusting that in my testing hasn't done a whole lot. I use it more for sag than I do anything else. I use it as a sag adjuster, which if you go down to the test button here, it pulls up your sag settings. I usually try and keep my rear sag between 105 or 104 to 106. The front sag between 155 to 60. Kind of just depends. You normally am around 55 to 58. is where I run my front sag. Static sag doesn't really matter in the game. Let's jump into bump. Bump, in layman's terms, it does say bump, but it actually is your compression rate. So how fast the shocks right here, if you look at my mouse, how fast where basically this is going to slide up. So that little bit is going to slide up into this fork tube. That's what the bump is changing. The less clicks you have, so I have 4 right now. If I go down to 2, I'm making the front shocks, or the front forks, I mean, stiffer. If I go, let's say to 6 instead of 4, I'm making them softer. So it basically is just adjusting how much oil is allowed through little ports, which are inside your shocks. So the lower the number, the less oil is allowed through. The higher the number, the more oil is allowed through. I want to preface it again, I could be wrong on this, so feel free to let me know in the comments. This is just what that video said, and this is kind of what I know on real life suspension tuning as well. So feel free to correct me. Also, these settings do work well for me in game, so whether they're right or wrong, they do work for me in game. Rebound is once your shocks compress, it adjusts how fast the shocks are going to extend back to their full length again. So the higher the number, the faster the shocks are going to rebound back to their full length. The lower the number, the slower they're going to rebound. Let me just check the notes here, make sure I'm correct. Yeah, so more clicks is quicker rebound, less clicks is slower rebound. For something like Supercross, you are going to want a little bit of a higher rebound, at least in my opinion. Outdoor, you can run a little bit less of a rebound, just because you don't need the shocks to rebound as quickly because you're not having obstacles come up against your bike as fast. Preload is simply just to adjust your sag. That's all preload is for. So preload has nothing to do with your actual suspension and how it's going to feel. So when you adjust your spring, bump, and rebound, you're going to go into test here and then look at what this is and then go, oh, okay, I need to go up on rebound or down on rebound, and then adjust your preload from there. So I'm at 2. If I go to 0, that is going to take my rebound from about 55 to 57. I can adjust the spring as well to get those numbers in the right position that I want. I run mine about 2 right now on the Yami is how I am running it, and it's feeling okay right now. I'm still doing some testing on it. Oil for your forks, mind you, this is all for front suspension. Oil is going to affect how do I say this? Basically, in real life, the more oil you have in your shock, when the shock gets to the very end of its stroke, the more oil you have, the stiffer the shock is going to become. The less oil you have, the softer the shock will be. In this game, it's actually backwards. So if you go down on oil, it's going to make the shock stiffer. If you go up on oil, it's going to make the shock softer at the end of its stroke. So it kind of helps with... it's kind of like a bypass is what you can kind of think of it, or like a bump stop basically on like a Baja truck. Once the shock gets to full bottom out, it has a little bit of give depending on how stiff or soft you want that give to be. You can adjust the oil. And kind of depending on riding style. My riding style is a little bit more aggressive, a little bit harder. I tend to overjump and underjump things. a little more than I should. So I run my oil usually a little bit lower than stock. So stock is 105, mine's at 95, just because I am taking those abrupt hard hits and I don't want the shock to quite bottom out fully. I want it to never quite bottom out. I always want it to have a little bit more give. So if you dump the oil way down to like 80, you're never going to bottom it out. If you crank it way up to 155, you're going to be bottoming it out a lot more because you're just simply relying on bump, rebound, and spring and all that kind of other stuff. That's kind of the best way that I can explain it. It's kind of hard to explain. But yeah, that's kind of the best way that I can explain it. With the rear suspension, it's the same exact thing as the front suspension. So spring is going to affect your rebound, is mostly what it's going to do. You can adjust it here and there if your suspension is feeling a little bit off. If you want to stiffen your suspension up a little bit, you can go up on the spring. If you want to soften it up a little bit, you can go down on the spring. But mostly, in my case, in my personal case, it's used mostly for sag. That's what I use it for. Slow bump is going to be the same thing as your front suspension bump. So the lower you go on clicks, the harder it's going to be. The higher you go on clicks, the softer it's going to be. And you can kind of read too, if you hover over the arrows, you can kind of read. So for slow bump, affects how quickly the suspension compresses. The more clicks you do, the softer the suspension is going to be, meaning the quicker it's going to compress. So that's kind of the way that works. And fast bump is the exact same way. The lower you go on number, so if I'm at 1 turn right here and I go to 3/4 turn, I'm making it harder. If I go up to let's say 1.5 turns, I'm going to make the suspension softer. An explanation on slow bump and fast bump. Slow bump is going to be kind of like your, let's say, chop. You know, so if you're riding outdoor and there's a lot of chop and it's real bumpy, that's going to be more of kind of like your slow bump. Or if you're rolling up the takeoff of a jump, your shocks aren't being compressed extremely fast. They're slowly compressing because you're slowly adding G-forces, downward G-forces on the bike. So it's slowly compressing. So that's what slow bump is. Fast bump is an abrupt hit on the suspension. So let's say you had, a 5-foot high wall and you were riding off that wall and you landed on flat ground. That's going to be an abrupt, like, bang onto the suspension. And so it's going to react differently than if it was a slow bang. So whoops have to do with fast bump. Coming up short on jumps have to do with fast bump. Over jumping jumps has to do with fast bump, because those are all very abrupt hits on the suspension that go from 0 to 100 really quickly. Where if you, like I said, you're rolling up the takeoff of a jump, that has to do more with slow bump because you're not abruptly hitting the suspension. Or if you land, just grease a downside, that has to do with slow bump because there's no abrupt like hit on the suspension. It's slowly compressing. So play around with those. You kind of know your riding style. If you overjump and underjump stuff a lot, if you like to ride fast, you might want your fast bump to be a little bit higher because it's going to be your bike is going to be taking a lot more abrupt hits. Where if you ride a little bit slower, you might want your fast bump to be less, and you want your slow bump to be a little bit more, just to stiffen up the bike a little bit more. So kind of play around with those. Mind you, also, when you are adjusting suspension settings, I would suggest going 1 to 2 clicks in either direction, whether it's up or down. And then, ride a few laps. Don't just, go down the straightaway and be like, oh, this is, shit. I don't like the way it feels. Ride a few laps, get used to it. Even if you're eating shit and you're over jumping or it feels like the rebound's extremely high, still ride a few laps because you might have made a mistake or something that caused it to feel like that. So ride a few laps, feel it out, and then if it is constantly happening, then you can be like, oh, okay, my rebound's too high. And then you can go in and lower your rebound. Or my suspension is too stiff, and then you can go in and adjust it from there. So don't just, go up or down 5 or 6 clicks and then go out, ride, a quarter of a lap and be like, this is dog shit, and then go in and try and change it. Take it slow. It is going to take time to build a setup for your bike. You are setting up the bike. So take your time with it, Go 1, 2 clicks maybe. Ride a few laps. If you go in, do some changes to it, ride a few laps, go back on those changes. Or maybe you went 2 clicks down on the bump, but it seems a little too stiff. Maybe go 1 back. So if I went to 2, seemed a little too stiff, maybe I'd go back to 3 right here. And not quite 4 where I was, but 3. Ride that, see how it feels. If bump doesn't seem to be the issue, or you have your bump down but the bike seems like it's a pogo stick, adjust your rebound, adjust your oil for your hard hitting, stuff like that. Oil and fast bump, so oil on the forks and fast bump on the rear shock are kind of like the same thing. They do similar things. Rebound is the exact same thing as the forks. So the higher up you go, the faster the rebound. The lower you go, the slower the rebound is going to be. So this says affects how quickly the suspension extends. More clicks is going to be softer rebound, which means quicker because there's less resistance stopping the shock from unloading, basically. So if I go up to 20, my rebound is going to be extremely fast because there's basically no resistance that's stopping that rear shock and or fork from extending. So it's just going to pop back right to its full extended state, basically. Where if I think I was on 17, if I go to, let's say, 14, my rebound is going to be slower because there's more resistance that's holding that shock back from just snapping back to its full extension. So that's kind of the way that works for front fork rebound and rear shock rebound as well. They're both the exact same thing, whether it's forks and or shock. Preload is the same exact thing as front preload for your forks. All it does is adjust sag. So I want my sag around 105. I prefer my bike to sit a little bit higher in the front, just a touch, not a lot, but just a touch. So I run my sag around 105, which means my preload has to be at 0. That's the way it has to be for where my spring is set. I can adjust my spring. I can go down to 331. That's going to put my rear sag up to 108. And then I would go in here, adjust my preload. Let's go 2 clicks, come back in, check it. It's at 102. I can go back down to 1 click, check it. It's at 105. So you can adjust it via that. I like my rear shock to be able to take a little bit more of a brunt, so I run a little bit stiffer of a spring is basically what that means. You're not actually putting a new spring in, but you're just twisting the spring to tighten it and or loosen it so it can take more of abrupt hits, basically. So I like my spring to be a little bit stiffer in the back, so I run 342. Stock is 319. So I actually run quite a bit stiffer in the back. That's just my personal preference. And like I said, I still am kind of working out the tune, one would say, that I have on this bike. So that covers front suspension and rear suspension. If you guys have any questions, feel free to leave them in the comments and I will be happy to answer them. And if I said anything wrong or you want to add anything to what I said, feel free to leave it in the comments. I'm an open book. I'll admit when I'm wrong. I'll admit when I fucked up. So if I messed up on anything, please let me know down in the comments, because I do not want to be spreading the wrong information. So I will go back in and change it or make an update video and read your comments and then make those changes in the video, because I do not want to be giving out any wrong information. So we covered general, we covered suspension. Let's jump over to drivetrain. I personally don't mess with my drivetrain for Supercross. I leave it stock on every single bike, and I just get used to how the gears are. Some gears are going to be a little bit shorter, some gears are going to be a little bit longer on each brand of bike that you ride. I personally main 450s. That's mostly what I ride. So if I jump onto a Cowie, second gear might be a little bit longer than if I'm on the Yamaha. Not by much, but just by a little bit. Enough to where it's noticeable, but not enough to where it's actually going to hinder you. If you do want to change it, it's relatively simple. You can kind of just look up here at the miles per hour or kilometers an hour, whatever you have. And so say I want to change my, let's just, for example, this is gear 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. That's the way it works, as you can see by the miles per hour. Say second gear is a little bit too short, right? Say 58 miles an hour is not quite quick enough. I want the bike to maybe be up to 60. I want second gear to just be a little bit longer, not by much, but just a little bit longer. I can go in here, change this from 13 to 14. Mind you, that is going to adjust every single gear. Went up to 62, that's a little high, and I can't go back down to 13 because that's wrong. So I can come back to my rear sprocket and go up a couple of teeth on the rear sprocket, and I'm at 51.14. So that's kind of how you adjust it. It's pretty self-explanatory. Also, I don't like messing with the gears too much, because you can get yourself into trouble. In outdoor, I'll usually up my gears by a little bit. I might go from a 49 to a 47 tooth just to get a little bit more range out of each gear. But in Supercross, like I said, I usually don't touch it. I just leave it default. So let me make sure. Yep, that's all good to go. So that's the drivetrain, or the gears, or your sprocket, whatever you want to call it. They're all correct. That's pretty self-explanatory. Just look at the miles per hour, change it to what you want. Just make little adjustments on everything that you do in the game. Test it. Like I said, ride a few laps, come back, make some more changes. That is drivetrain covered. And then we go into others. Others is where it can get a little bit confusing for some people, because if you hover your mouse over one of these little arrows, nothing pops up telling you what it actually does. So for fork offset is going to affect your rake and trail in real life and in the game, and it's adjusting your triple clamp position. So basically how far forward your forks are versus how far back they are. So far back would mean bringing the top triple clamp forward a little bit, bringing this wheel closer to the frame of the bike, making the forks more up and down. It's going to improve your turning, but it's going to hinder your top speed stability, is basically what fork offset does. So the higher the number, the more stable. The lower the number, the quicker handling. So if I go up to, let's say 25, I'm going to have a more stable bike, whether that's in corners or straight lines. The bike is going to want to be vertical. It's not going to want to be leaned over, so it's going to be a more stable bike. But when I do try and lean it over, it's going to have a hard time turning, and it's not going to be as quick and nimble and snappy as you might want it to be. So mess around with fork offset. It's very touchy, so go up one and down one is what I would suggest. You can do more if you want, but I would suggest up one, down one. And like I said, to just cover that one more time, the higher the number, the more stable, the lower the number, the quicker handling. So if I bring this down to 20, it's going to bring these forks closer into the frame of the bike. It's going to bring this axle closer to the front of the bike. It's going to bring the top section of your tubes or your forks farther out, but it's going to bring everything closer into the frame of the bike, making it quicker handling and more snappy and responsive. So mess around with it and find a setting that you like. Fork height, kind of self-explanatory, can be difficult to understand though, so I'll go ahead and explain it. Fork height has to do with the top of your triple clamps. So if you hold, let's just say you hold one hand out in front of you, hold your left hand out in front of you and just make your hand flat, and take your right hand and you put it even with your left hand. If you take your fork height and it's at 0 millimeters, that means it's going to be even, just like we are now with your hands. If you bring the fork height up to, say, 4 millimeters like I am, if you take your right hand and move it up a little bit, it's going to bring the forks higher than the top of your triple clamps. So if your forks are even with the top of your triple clamps, that's 0 millimeters. If your forks are higher than the top of your triple clamps, that is going to mean a higher number, basically. It doesn't necessarily mean 4 millimeters because you can adjust it from any number. You can adjust it from 0 to, I don't even know how high it goes, fucking 20 millimeters. So the higher the number, the higher up the fork sits outside of or above the triple clamp. Meaning, if you have this right here, if you raise the forks above the triple clamp, you're going to be bringing this, say, axle nut right here up to probably about here. Maybe I'm not saying about there at like that. I'm just saying you're going to be bringing it up. If you put this to 0, you're going to be bringing this axle nut down a little bit because the forks are going to be even with the triple clamp. So you're going to be bringing the forks down to make them even with the top of the triple clamp. You put it back to 4 where I had it, like the way I run it. You're going to be bringing this up because the forks are going to be sticking 4 millimeters out of the top of the triple clamp. This affects steering. So the higher up you have your number, so if I'm at 4, say I go to 8, I'm bringing this nut up here. It's going to make the bike, it's going to bring this front wheel closer to the frame of the bike by moving it in a vertical line like this, not in a rotated line like when we did the fork offset like this. It's going to be bringing it in a vertical line like this where the mouse is moving. And so the higher the number, the higher it sticks out of the top, meaning you're going to have the front end sit a little bit lower. It can help with turning. It can make your turning worse. It kind of all depends. Fork offset and fork height kind of work together, so you kind of have to adjust them together and play around with them together. You have to remember, if you move your fork height up, it's going to be bringing the wheel closer to the frame, so you might want to adjust your fork offset and bring the wheel out from the frame a little bit to keep your steering the way it was. If you didn't like it the way it was, then don't adjust it. But if you like the way your steering is, you just want the front to sit a little bit lower, then you're going to have to mess around with those two, and they kind of work in conjunction. So play around with them, figure out a setting that works good for you, and go from there. Swing arm length, pretty self-explanatory. You have your swing arm at the back of the bike right here. It's It's kind of hard to see because this whole page is in the way, but right where the mouse is, you have that swing arm that runs out to your rear axle of your dirt bike. Extending that is going to make the bike more stable again in a straight line. It's not going to want to turn as good. Shortening that swing arm length is going to make the bike turn extremely well, but it's going to not like to handle in a straight line, and it can make whoops a little bit harder. Whether you lengthen it and or shorten it, it can make the whoops a little bit harder. I personally don't touch it just because in real life, guys that are going to be lengthening their swing arms are mostly, it's going to be a lot of factory stuff. You're going to be lengthening swing arm lengths, and it's really not by much. They're really not lengthening them by much. So they're really the only people that have access to it that actually do it. Obviously, everyone has access to it, but they're the really only people that do it. So I don't really fuck with it. I don't really change it. You can change the way the ass end of the bike plants into a corner simply by fork offset and fork height. If the ass end is sliding out, adjust these numbers. Maybe make your front end sit a little bit lower. If the ass end is sliding out and you have your fork height really high above the triple clamps, meaning the front end is super low, maybe try lowering the number a little bit and adjusting that. Just play around with it. And rod length. So down under here, you have your rear shock that gets connected up to, some guys call it a dog bone. Some guys call it linkage. It kind of just depends. This rear shock connects up to a link. Kind of does look kind of like a dog bone-ish kind of thing. If you look at my mouse, it kind of just, you have like one bar here, one bar on this side, so kind of like an H, and then you have one bar that runs here, and then one bar that runs there. So it's basically kind of like a rectangle kind of thing. Rear shock connects to that. That connects to your swing arm. By extending that, what you're doing is you're, let me check the notes here. Stimulating rear shock of the bike. So stiffening that, meaning going up on it, will make, or sorry, not stiffening it, lengthening it, lengthening your rod length is going to make the bike stiffer in the back end. So it's going to compress the shock a little bit while you're sitting on the bike. It's going to be compressed. So imagine your shock is at 0% compression when you're sitting on it, even though that's not correct. Just for example purposes, say it's at 0% while you're sitting on it. If you lengthen that rod length, the bike might sit at, let's say, 20%. It's going to compress that shock to 20% instead of 0%. Say it's at 50, or a better example would be 50%. You lengthen it, it's going to bring it up to, say, 75. You bring it back to where it was, the bike is back at 50%. You shorten that, it's going to lower that rear wheel, making your suspension travel more, maybe bringing it down to 25%. So it all kind of just depends on ride height, how stiff you want your shocks to start. I run mine a little bit stiffer. Play around with it. It's one of those things that's kind of hard to explain. Play around with it, figure it out. Go up one click, down one click. Just play with it. Figure it out. But yeah, that's kind of the best way that I can explain it there for you. And I think that's gonna do it. We covered general, we covered suspension, we covered drivetrain, we covered others. So if you guys have any questions, please feel free to drop them in the comments, and I will make sure to get back to you guys on that. If I said anything incorrect, feel free to correct me in the comments, and I will either respond to it, dropping an update in the comments, or I will just drop another video once I get a conglomerate of comments correcting me. I will drop a whole nother video explaining suspension again to you guys. I think that covered it pretty well. But yeah, hope you guys did enjoy. Hope you found it helpful. Remember to go like, subscribe, and comment. Really does help me out, and I really do appreciate it. With all that being said, hope you guys have a good rest of your day and or evening, and I will see you guys in the next video. Peace.